Okay, so we've got, what I want to do is just illustrate the kinds of people we've got in the room, yeah? So we've got a parent, we've got a practitioner, practice researcher, and what about any kind of, have we got any PhD students, people doing research in the room? A few people, yeah? Anybody doing anything particularly on disadvantaged students that you want to share? No? Yeah, David?
Yeah, well, since this morning I'm a little bit clearer as to what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be looking at how hobbies and interests, perhaps incorporated into the school curriculum, can improve opportunities for disadvantaged students.
Okay, so there's a few PhD students here, and we've got some people from Sheffield. Would somebody from Sheffield like to come all the way down from sunny Sheffield to the forum?
Hello everybody, yes, I'm from sunny Sheffield. There's also people from sunny Wakefield. We all got up really early, so I'm feeling a bit tired. But I'm an academic and I work in the field of education, literacy and culture. And I work in Rotherham. And I don't know what else you want to say.
That's fine.
With young people.
Yeah, hello. Yes, you're interested in.
I'm interested in resilience in that context.
Cool. And Natalie from Wakefield.
Yeah, so I'm Natalie. I work at the Hepworth Wakefield, which is an art gallery. I work very much with the collections and with the artworks and with artists to think about how we can develop and deliver programs for young people across all ages, from all backgrounds, particularly in reference to this, looking at young people who are out of work or not in education, and how the arts can really kind of benefit those young people and give them opportunities.
Great. So we've done Sheffield and Wakefield, and we've also got Liz from London, haven't we?
I'm Liz Holt. I'm from the University of London. I'm in the Department of Psychosocial Studies, and my area of research is resilient learning. Primarily I work with adults. I also have a second interest about being here, which is I'm the mother of an adopted daughter who spent the first 2 years of her life in the social care system.
Okay, so anybody else fancy introducing themselves? I don't want to make everybody introduce themselves because I know not everybody likes to, but anybody else feel like saying who they are and where they're from?
I could say I work at the Hastings campus in the literature team and in the School of Literature, Film and Media. But I also work teaching for an organisation called Hand in Hand Parenting, and I'm really trying to work out how to kind of bring, like my interest is in how when you support parents and children at home, their outcomes in school obviously ours. Yeah. So I'm interested in how to sort of bring that my sort of academic work more in touch with the other work that I do outside of university. So I'm figuring that out.
Okay. Last chance for anybody, yeah?
My name is Eva Tobin. I'm a welfare coordinator at Badfit, which is Brighton Home and Sixth College. We've just introduced a tutorial program called the 6 R's, and one of those is resilience. So we're now educating a lot of our 16 to 19-year-old students about resilience.
Wow, oh, that's exciting. Great. Oh, did you?
Shall I? Yeah, I'm Michelle Tarling. I work for the widening participation team at the University of Brighton. So very much working with students from disadvantaged backgrounds to support their progression through education and into higher education. So that's.
Right. So we've got a beautiful, ripe mix of people in this room, haven't we? We've got some more kind of standard Boffiny academics, like our lovely Jörg and lovely Suna.
You may regret this. Anyway, we'll see.
Yeah, this is like very exciting. I love this space because it really does seem to draw different people in. So I think we'll go over to you now, Jörg, and you're going to have 30, 40 minutes involved in workshopping, dancing, and crayoning.
Not sure about the latter. Right, okay, I better give a health warning. I'm a psychologist through and through. Most of my work is really an application of psychology to medicine and healthcare, care, health improvement. So that's where I come from. I have an interest in resilience, a very strong interest, but come from a slightly different angle to Angie, but I won't go into that. We can discuss that later. So what I really want to do, I won't actually talk much about resilience because otherwise we'll sit here still in a very long, very late in the afternoon. But I want to talk about some papers which one of them originally I found, then one came from Angie, and then I found some more as a way of looking at how we can help. Now, help is perhaps already the wrong term, but how we can facilitate young people making the best out of their life. Is it working? No. It worked earlier on. It's a bit awesome usually.
It was doing this yesterday. There you go.
Oh, it works.
That one works. It was doing it yesterday, this one.
Okay, but it works. Right, okay. I won't go, so I just repeated some of the abstract or summary which I wrote. So basically, inequalities have profound consequences, and I will just provide as a reminder. Some of you might be much more comfortable sitting over there than me being in your line of vision. So one of the interesting findings I always find, and there is now a very nice map available, which shows how life expectancy in London declines when you go from the west to the east. So along the central line is probably the most pronounced effect, where you have differences of close to 15 years. If you look at long-term conditions, poverty and COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, are highly associated. People with COPD and who are poor are much more likely to end up in hospital than somebody who is middle class or well off and has COPD. And then in relation to education, in particular for men, there is no British data available from the OECD for Britain or the England, but when you look at the difference in Portugal, where the difference between those who are poorly educated and those who are highly educated is very small, when you go over to the Czech Republic, it's extreme. There is a difference of 16 to 17 years. So education has a massive impact, and as I say, particularly for males. Now, inequalities, we know, are there for a long time, and the very first thing Margaret Thatcher did when she came to power was to suppress the Black Report. But we know about these inequalities, that they have major consequences, and they persist, and they actually have been accentuated over the last 20, 30 years, roughly. And they don't seem to become weaker or less pronounced, although the pattern is quite complex, but generally there is an accentuation. And of course, as everybody here I'm sure reads the Daily Mail, even they say that we have the worst social mobility in the Western world, although there is actually then, I didn't go into that, sort of they come back to grammar schools, flogging and hanging, basically. So, but even they acknowledge that there is a problem with social mobility. Now, social inequalities are transmitted through the generations. And I will show some figures on that. So, for example, wage persistence, as it's technically called, for males in the UK is very strong. What do I mean with wage persistence? I'll just go here and show you some of these figures. So when you look at here, Britain, I didn't get round, is actually here. So it's the second worst in Europe. So the higher that bar, the more the father's or the parents' wage influences the child's or son's wage in this. For women, it's not quite as extreme, but again, there are similar patterns. So this persistence is quite considerable in the UK. The UK, by no means, is the only country, and I don't think we should feel as bad as sometimes the press makes us feel, but it is pronounced. Education persistence, the UK actually fares fairly well, at least in terms of headline figures, but then there are concerns about the quality of a large minority of graduates who are actually not better in basic skills, maths, literacy, than secondary school leavers in other countries. So there are figures around 20% or so of graduates who do not do well on these tests. Factors which play a major role are teacher pay, social and tax policies. A factor which can counteract that is late stratification, as I call it, or grouping, tracking of students according to performance, ability, or whatever you want to do. So the later that happens, the more, the better, the weaker students do relatively. So in Germany it's quite interesting. There are states which have much later stratification than others within the country, and you can see a difference. So in Berlin it's much later than, say, in Bavaria, and that has an impact on how those from more disadvantaged backgrounds do. So I showed this. So this is around. This is now around persistence in below upper secondary education. So the term, what they mean with this upper secondary education is up to GCSE levels, roughly. So Britain is here. We are not doing that well here either, but as I said, for university education, we are doing pretty well. Now, frequently, and I just did the same, we focus on one factor at a time. Being a man or a woman, being black or white, being old or young. And I only learned about this weird thing called intersectionality theory a year ago, or not even a year ago. And while don't want to now go into this, but it is perhaps worth thinking that some of the disadvantages we experience, or people experience, may not just be, as I put it here, what did I put, a linear combination. So this is me as talking as a statistician. So it's not just about being maleness or femaleness, black or white, but the combination of those factors may actually lead to much more severe discrimination, stigma, disadvantage than any of the aspects on their own. So this is, I think, quite important, and I believe intersectionality theory has made quite an interesting contribution on this, mostly using qualitative methods, but it is actually possible to do it in a quantitative framework as well. Okay, so this is just to really to make us think that we should not just look on these factors individually and without the interactions or the combination they can form. I said I will not say much about resilience, so I just used, I think, what is a widely agreed definition for that. It is around successful adaptation in the face of some adversity or challenging situation. What you will see in these examples, I will now move on straight away, I believe none of them ever uses the term resilience. I haven't found this term in those papers, but I believe it's fair to say that what those papers do is help young people, or what this research does, is help young people adjust more successfully. So, in education or in an educational context where I have shown you some figures where this persistence of through the generations is particularly pronounced, early on, in some countries more than in others, etc. That is perhaps one core domain or setting where we can intervene. So I will now move to these illustrations. So one paper, which was very recently published by Stevens and colleagues, is about the social class achievement gap. What American universities, I should say now, all of the studies which I'm relying on have been carried out in the US. So the US universities notice that actually university, instead of helping overcoming these barriers or making people more equal, it actually, as I put it, accentuates again these achievement gaps. In this paper, they distinguish between first generation and continuing generation students. A first generation student, as the name suggests or the label suggests, is the first person going to university, where neither of the parents have a degree. A continuing generation student is somebody where at least one parent has a degree. The idea was that instead of focusing on claiming we are all the same or we should be all the same, actually the idea was to focus on the differences in background. And I left the word out. Well, these students may feel left out because they are not part of the middle class culture of higher education. They need to learn the rules of the game. And in my view, I think these games or these rules are actually quite powerful. And when I look back at my own cohort of students with whom I started in Germany, there was a very clear pattern that those who came from a working class background were more likely to drop out. Now this is perhaps in Germany even more noticeable because typically 30% of students drop out. In engineering it's much higher, in psychology it's maybe 20% or 30%. And there is no acknowledgement of that really. Stevens had this developed and his colleagues developed this idea of, I actually don't know whether it's a him or a her, I better check that. So we'll do that now before we be unfair. They came up with this idea of intergroup dialogue. Hang on, where is it gone? It's a woman. Sorry, she. So this idea of the intergroup dialogue will bring together people from diverse backgrounds, and it will hopefully increase understanding, collaboration, empathy, civic engagement. And above all, the idea was that it increases students' sense of comfort, ability to operate in diverse settings, and equip them better to navigate their own experience at university. And based on Pupil Steele and Cohen-Vargas, they developed activities which created identity or a setting which was identity safe. Now it's a dreadful term in my view, but it captures something which I got over the last year very interested in, which is that even when you look at a condition like diabetes, people feel, a considerable number feels very uncomfortable, for example, taking their medication in public. They feel discriminated against, they feel stigmatized, and here possibly the same. So reducing stigmatizing processes, discrimination, is a very important aspect of these settings. And I think that's highly relevant to probably the interest many of you may have. So in this paper, I won't go into the details now, but just to give you an idea, it was a reasonably large study. They actually followed standard procedures like random allocation to groups. I will explain what these groups are. And so the core aspect was that they had two groups. They had an intervention which they called a difference education panel, focusing on these differences, making students aware of them and dealing effectively with them. And then they had a standard panel, which where they used strategies which universities in the US typically use. So just to illustrate, in the difference model or panel, all of these panels met for 1 hour only. So it's actually a very minimal intervention. So they had, for example, there was a presenter. Can you provide an example of an obstacle that you faced when you came to university and how you resolved it? And then there was these two kind of answers. Should I read them out? Can you read them?
Would you mind? 'Cause I can't see.
Yeah, okay. So the first generation panelist. So that's this student without parents with a degree. Because my parents didn't go to college, they weren't always able to provide me with the advice I needed. So it was sometimes hard to figure out which classes to take and what I wanted to do in the future. But there are other people who can provide that advice, and I learned that I needed to rely on my advisor more than other students. Whereas the continuing generation panelists, coming from a very different background, I went to a small private school and it was great college prep. We got lots of one-on-one attention, so it was a big adjustment going into classes with 300 people. I left less overwhelmed when I took the time to get to know other students in the class. So there is this focus on background and prior experience. Now in the standard panel, what you do to be successful in your classes, this was just go to class and pay attention. If you don't understand something or have a hard time with the material, meet with your teaching assistant or professor during office hours. So, I mean, that's standard thing what I probably would have said to students for many years. And I would never, go on to these things when I supervised students. I cannot remember that at the universities I worked, people or lecturers actually alluded to that, and actually it would have probably been seen almost as offensive in a UK context, or certainly in the German context. It would have been completely unacceptable. I don't have data on this, but I'm pretty sure that's the sense I had when I was at university there. So these meetings lasted an hour. There were a number of these question and answer games. And then there was one very important aspect, which I haven't now mentioned here, but which I will come back to. Every student in this difference education panel had to produce a video testimonial to say what he or she is going to do over the next year. So this is, I think, pretty important. So it wasn't just this session, which was important, but there was creation of serious commitment, even though I would still call it low cost, low intensity, short intervention. I won't go into all of these figures now, because I think some of the people who are not into statistics, that will be boring to them. But what is very important, and I'll just jump through some of those, is that this very brief intervention actually made quite a difference to those students in the experimental or the intervention group compared to the standard group. So just to come to some of the sort of easier to read findings. So when you look at these grade point averages, which they give in the US, then there was, with the first generation students, so on the left, it's the difference education condition, standard condition. You can see, and some of you may know about confidence intervals, there are quite big differences, whereas there are no differences for the continuing generation. In fact, actually they profited slightly, but that is not significant. Similarly here, although the pattern is more complex, that the number of resources sought by the student increased considerably in the difference education condition, but not the standard condition. Although for the continuing generation student, there was a disadvantage. I won't go into this, except for saying that what was particularly important for students to make a difference is this tendency to seek resources. So finding the resources to help oneself to achieve or get a move to succeed, that is very important. And I think when I believe what I see in Britain or in my own world, then this ability to find resources is, for example, a key aspect in stress theory, saying that those who are good in having resources at their disposal or accessing them, they have a strong stress buffering effect and overall do better. So this is plagiarism. I didn't, or mostly, I didn't have the time to rephrase this. But the main point is that this 1 hour difference education really made a big difference. So I was very impressed, and I'm also, I put it now, doubtful whether this is all for real or whether this was potluck that they did so well. So this is, for example, some interesting issue which we could address. So they matter, these backgrounds, and they should be leveraged to foster more inclusive and equitable schools. How are we doing for time?
We've got another 15 minutes for talking.
Well, then we are all right. If you want to ask any questions, I'm easy. Just ask, or if there is something, I can elaborate on some of the aspects. I don't know the studies that well that I can comment on everything, but they are available and they can be sent to you.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Could you just clarify for me what the intervention was, or was it a lot of different things?
No, it was this 1 hour.
Just the one thing?
Yep, just the one thing. That is the very surprising thing. So it was basically, let's jump back briefly, it was this...
The video thing, wasn't it? But what did they do with the video at the end? Did they come back to it?
That the video was just to confirm. The intervention was actually just this 1 hour session, but this is an interesting question. I didn't look whether they did come back to this video or whether, but they didn't manipulate that aspect. Everybody did that in this group, and it is one of these activities where there's quite a lot of research in psychology or social psychology now saying that you really need to do something around almost making contractual arrangements, making people to think in great detail around what they want to achieve, how they are going about it in very concrete practical steps. So that's also, for example, some of you may have heard of theory of planned behavior. Has anybody heard of the theory? In that theory, there are recent developments, they call them goal intentions, where that concrete thinking through about how, for example, you become more physically active, change your diet, whatever it is, work better in school, where that concrete, tangible thinking is very important. It's not done with, the goodwill, oh, I'll stop smoking, or I do a bit more work for school. It needs to be very tangible, very specific, and they have a notion there. This needs to be a specific time, a specific day, it needs to be with specific people in a location, etc.
That's what they were doing in this hour. They were doing planning, goal setting and planning.
That was left to them. They didn't do any, there was no intervention. It was 1 hour. This is what we need to remember.
So adults mentoring.
Young adults, to listen to these questions, and so they had various people asking questions and students, either first generation students or second generation students answering these questions.
So it was reflective. It wasn't planning next steps. It was thinking about how do I find myself here?
Yeah.
I'm from a different class.
Yeah.
It's tough.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
it's a consciousness raising, like making sense of why it's.
Yeah, but it's also probably acknowledging. Maybe the interesting question is what the key ingredient is. Whether it is acknowledging these differences, we are not the same. So these are all open questions and very good questions, I think, which need to be asked. Yeah.
Were they mixed first generation, second generation students talking together to answer the questions?
No, they were yes, they were mixed. Yes.
So they're learning from each other.
Yes, they were mixed. Yeah, that was very important. This mix. So this is this idea about these environments which are safe to experience these differences without stigma or discrimination.
Sorry, could you just go over what the standard panel is and the difference panel in terms of the people in it then?
The people were the same.
They were the same?
They were randomly allocated to these two groups, so it was actually properly done. Mm-hmm. So they were in both groups, there were first generation students and second generation or continuing generation students. And then they found these quite strong differences based on their limited intervention.
So the questions in each of them were different, the prompts?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is this. Yeah?
Got it.
Okay. Yeah. Somebody?
Yeah, sorry. I was just, the standard panel question is asking the student to describe what they did.
Yeah.
Whereas the difference panel is asking the student to describe an obstacle that they encountered.
Yes.
So I think that's...
Yeah, it is very much focused on obstacles or barriers and how to overcome them, but the difference taking into account where the person comes from, whether they come from a family which is used to operating and knows the rules of the game in an academic environment compared to somebody who doesn't know these
so
rules.
Wasn't that made explicit though?
Sure.
I read the article a long time ago. And wasn't there something about you brought to the conversation or the prompts are thinking about that actually, you provided information about, you're at a disadvantage. Wasn't there something that happened in that panel? No?
Maybe there is. I mean, there is a lot of small print, and there is very detailed information available on the internet on that study, which I have to admit I haven't read. It's another 20 pages of documentation. So it is. We could find out more on these questions.
Because I just recall there being in the questions something about where the group has a discussion about coming to realise the potential disadvantage they have and how sort of empowering that was. That actually I'm behind the 8 ball here, so that's not reasonable. What am I going to do to get over these hurdles?
So whether it made the other students feel guilty, that's what I was thinking about, because it's very unusual, because as you say, you don't tend to situate people so explicitly like that, do you here? And we were thinking about putting in a bid to maybe do some more research around this, and in schools particularly. But there is an issue about the whole thing about actually talking so openly about class in England. This was in the States, you see, which again is a very different context.
But it doesn't just happen, it happens everywhere, in my understanding of life. So it wouldn't necessarily just be exclusive to an academic background. It could be in any situation, anywhere. And while the world development, that's in inverted commas, is suggesting that equality is the right way to go, actually that ignores the fact that there is still blatant inequality. So if we actually bring it into the open and go, okay, there is blatant inequality, let's start from the reality, rather than pretending we're up there when we're not, that actually would create, I think, a flatter playing field, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah, I mean, interesting issue, but I would agree with you, yeah.
It does fit in quite well, I think, with the ideas of acknowledging and understanding your own privilege positions, and the young people I work with are actually quite aware of that debate and that sort of theory, and they are talking about, they'll say something, I'll start saying, as to speak right now, I don't understand that, and they will sort of come forward in that way, so I think they would probably understand how this is working and see it.
What kind of people do you work with?
A-level students,
okay.
So 16 to 19-year-olds.
Yeah, I mean, these students were not that different in terms of age. They were 18, if I remember. I hope I remember rightly. So they were actually, very similar. Yeah. Just like, I think they go to the university usually after the age of 17 in the US, so they are very young.
I think
very young. I think that's too old. Sorry, go on.
I was just thinking your point's really interesting.
Nobody in Europe goes that young to university.
No, I don't mean to university, I mean the actual study.
Yeah.
Because kids know of difference at 3, 2. They go to people's houses. So, anyway.
Yeah, okay.
You were going to say?
I was just thinking about the transferability of it. And like, in our world, where we work with parents and we talk about the discrimination they face because they enter a world of disability, even though they're not disabled, whether or not doing that inequalities sort of work openly like your panel, whether or not it then provides a different sort of mindset for that group of parents to hassle more or not internalise the crap or be more active and demanding or want something more.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's what I was curious about, the politics and the hassle.
Yeah, I mean I think that would be very interesting to look at into that.
And I think that raises questions for those of us that are working in widening access, is that we often worry about using the term disadvantage. We work with disadvantage and that we don't want to say to them, oh, you were disadvantaged. And the same when we're working with parents and we are having this debate, well, maybe we should be more open about it. Maybe it is more empowering. Maybe we're kind of skirting around the edges and it should be more direct and there should be more understanding among the groups that we're working with.
It's not okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, but it could also be seen that if you are a group of parents with a special need, a child who has special needs, educational needs or disabilities or whatever, if you're somebody who's come in who hasn't got that experience, then you're at a disadvantage. So it can work both ways. Disadvantage is seen as a word that is discriminatory, but it doesn't have to be, or it could be positively discriminatory in some ways. So I think it depends how you pitch it. Why don't you ask the people you're working with?
Yeah.
And ask them what they want to be grouped as.
So,
maybe.
We are looking at doing more of that, but yeah.
Okay, I'll move on. Because, okay. So the next study has been carried out with younger people, and this focuses very much on possible selves or academic possible selves, and of course they use then PSs and APSs, but let's leave that alone. So the idea here is to focus on, the basic idea is that young people, or actually everybody, I would say, we construct these possible selves by synthesizing what we know about our traits and abilities and what we know of the skills needed to become various future selves. So I'm sure these sort of things happen in various ways at different stages of life, but maybe it's particularly pronounced for young people who try to define or develop a proper identity, a proper notion of themselves and who they are in this world, what their role is, etc. So the Oyserman, who is very active in this field and has actually, I highly recommend her website. All her papers are available there. She's at the University of Michigan. She put it like this, and I think actually that's a very good quote, so I'll read it out. To judge what this difficulty means, this difficulty to achieve, whether these academic potentials, possible selves, are true possible selves. So she has this idea that a person thinks about his or her future and thinks about, is that possible? Is that something which rings true for me? Something authentic, if you want to use that term? Or does that contradict other important social identities? To judge whether attaining these possible selves is plausible or not worth the effort, teens must answer the implied question, why is engaging in the academic possible self so hard for me? Is this really the true me? Do we have possible selves like this? Likewise, they must judge whether particular behavioral patterns, e.g. asking for help, are likely to work and if they can contradict in-group identity. Will asking the teacher for help actually help me succeed in school, or is it just a white thing to do? And when I was maybe more maybe more idealistic. I worked with some young offenders as part of my studies, and one of the issues was that there were certain things you would just not be seen doing in that group, that would just be completely out, like, sitting over a book and reading this. I mean, who would do that? And so there are these issues around these identities, and I think that is actually a very important other aspect to what we are about. Identity selves. If somebody has a clear definition what the difference between the two is, let me know. I have an idea, but it's not something I feel particularly an expert on, although I've thought a lot about it over the years. So Oyserman developed this scheme where they asked young people, who will you be next year? Next year I expect to be, and then they have something like 4 or 5 options, and a person generates that him or herself, and if they give a yes to that, what am I doing now to be that way next year? And importantly also they looked at fears. Next year I want to avoid, e.g. for example failing grades and having to do a year again, as would happen in the US or also in Germany. This is not something which would happen in this country. These, parking and resitting an entire school year. So this is the basic tool she uses, or her team uses, to look at these identities and possible selves. So then there she has very detailed instructions on how to use that. So this is just for next year possible selves, though there are these 6 main categories: achievement-oriented, interpersonal relationships, personality traits, health, material lifestyle, and then there are the negative ones. And so she has others for a separate set for selves to be avoided, and then she has a complex system for looking at balanced ideas, which I explained briefly, which are particularly important. So somebody says, I want to do well next year, and as one of the things to avoid, I also want to avoid failing next year. So if both of these things turn up, then she considers those sort of considerations or selves as particularly important, because there is both a kind of what I would call achievement motivation, and there is sort of avoidance motivation. And if they come together, they are a particular powerful driving force in her view. So that's an interesting elaboration, I think, rather than just looking at differences or so. And it is, as I say, a qualitative approach in the sense that you need to really code these things in detail, but then it can be turned into numbers and can be analyzed statistically. And it's just, again, these psychologists love these flow diagrams, but it is important to point to one aspect. So these possible selves, which a person is keen on, they, in her view, lead self-regulatory behaviors. And in psychology, this whole idea of self-regulation, emotion regulation, control, there are different terms psychologists use, they're all roughly or have overlapping meanings, They are core when it comes to determining academic outcomes, but also levels of well-being and physical health. So the basic idea is that the selves drive self-regulation or help self-regulation, and then in turn determine outcomes, both mental, physical, career-oriented ones. And a bit similar to Stevens, they created sessions, but this time they were dependent what paper you look at. Roughly 10 sessions of around an hour or perhaps a little bit more. And this is just one example, the first session. So creating a group, facilitators and participants share expectations and concerns about program. Activities include introducing one another. This is 8th grade. Does anybody know what's 8th grade in the US? This is where I fall down. I was going to look it up, but
it's quite similar to England.
12 years old, I guess.
That's what I thought. Okay, so they are early adolescents. Can we, if we agree on that, that each group has something to contribute to school achievement, and that others also want to do well in school, and so on. There are these various activities then, and later on there is a session which I can't now remember whether it is with teachers and parents or whether it's a separate session involving teachers and parents. But the main point is teachers and parents are involved, although in a minor way. And again, there were reasonable successes, perhaps not quite as powerful as with the Stevens study, but for example, school attendance increased quite considerably as a result of that intervention.
What, just those bits of paper that they put? They actually did record school attendance in object by school records. It's not just a boy or girl said, I attended more regularly. No, I mean what the intervention was, just to clarify again exactly.
So it was this course with around 10 sessions, around an hour or a little bit longer, and each session having a topic area and being highly, sounds to me pretty well structured. But I emailed Oyserman, and you know, what do you get back? Oh, you can buy my book next year. So the book is, maybe you have more success. But anyway, she was quite helpful in commenting on some issues, but the book will be available next year, Oxford University Press, in March, maybe add a few months extra, so it will be summer, but it's around then. And unfortunately, manuals which were available on the web, they have all been withdrawn for good reasons, I would say. You know, that's just what happens. I'm sure she's after a bug or two.
She gets paid enough already. Hasn't she done any journal articles?
Yeah, but they don't. I've the paper which has the most detailed snapshot pictures. I provide. That's what I have. It's not too bad, and I think they would need to. I don't know whether we can work on her and get it if we wanted to pursue something like this.
So who went to the course? The parents and the young people?
Mostly the young people, and there was one session where teachers and parents were involved, but only one session. So it was really focusing on the children, and there was some interesting aspect. The initial sessions were all individually focused. What I mean, children did activities or expressed their own views, and once the groups grew together a bit more, then they started having proper group activities, which I thought was quite a nice feature to ensure that everybody felt comfortable, not exposed, and the groups work. Now, we just have to take her word for it. I will come to an evaluation in a few minutes. So there is a reasonable amount of evidence she provides. And all I do now is that for a number of factors like mean estimated hours per week on work, for the intervention group, this drops down over 2 years or 20 months, less than for the non-intervention group or for the control group. For the initiative score, they do better, the intervention group. For the numbers of semesters completed, they do, what is this? I now forgot. But well, we'll focus just on the GPA, this grade point average. Again, the kids from the intervention group do better. Now, admittedly, most of you are probably not that statistically inclined, but when I see graphs like this, then okay, there is a solid, consistent pattern of where the intervention group does better, but the effects or the strength of the effects is quite small. So one should not expect that this can be easily translated into individual interventions which then make a big difference. But then having said this, once you work with individuals or very small groups, you may tailor your interventions and you may get actually stronger effects rather than in a study which started with around 200 or 300 children, 250, and split them into the intervention group and the control group. And then, yeah?
You asked me to make faces at you.
Okay,
in
that's
terms
good.
of your workshop thing.
Yep, okay, we'll finish in a minute. We'll leave this out. And I'll just summary. So there was more academic initiative. They improved on standard test scores. They had a reduction in depression, absences, and in-school misbehavior. It was sustained over some times. And one thing what I'm least sure about is whether the selves actually changed. And it's very difficult the way the papers was written to actually come to a definite conclusion. So, you know, I can be very skeptical, but at the same time I think there may be something in it. So, summary and conclusion. So, what the message is out of these 5 studies I looked at, I only talked about, actually what I did, I talked about 2 studies by Oyserman, but didn't really differentiate between the 2, and the study by Stevens. There are some others which are similarly important to us or your interest, or at least mine. So they are very brief, they are low intensity in general terms. I would call them something like psychosocial education. I talk about psychoeducation in some other context, but this is much more psychosocial. This is just a proposal, better words welcome, or phrases, rather than therapy. An awareness of differences may be very important. Stigma and discrimination require minimizations. Effects are on achievements, but also well-being and health. And some of these studies use proper RCT, random controlled trial methodology. Now the limitations, all studies were carried out in the US, and there are some weaknesses. The samples are convenience samples, so they just took whom they could get. They were all based on limited number of sites, so Oyserman had in one study 1 site and another one 3 or 4. Stevens had just 1 site. Another study I didn't talk about, Cohen 2 sites and Mio 3 sites. So they're all really still small studies, and one of the core aspects of the US is that it's a very diverse country. Messages, so time limit, I don't repeat this. Then maybe this focus on differences is really important. It's not about égalité, it's about la différence, or whatever the la différence. Identity-based motivation is a relatively recent concept, and whether you call them selves or identity, I think that's a core idea which I'm very keen on, partly based on other work I do on smoking cessation. And in this country there is a guy called Robert West who has developed prime theory, which is very much about, for example, helping smokers to change their identity. So thinking, I'm now a non-smoker. I'm not a smoker anymore, I'm a non-smoker, and once people make that transition, they are more likely to stay abstinent. So that is perhaps really important here. These changes, they need to be very tangible. Whatever we propose, whatever we talk about differences, about plans, they need to be tangible, whether you call them implementation intentions or goal intentions, whether you call them these video testimonials or create something like this, that's another question. But there needs to be this commitment created through these activities. So, this is me. Any questions before we move on to the next part? No, I killed it all off now.
We're excited about doing the exercise.
Okay, right. Then let's look at this. So what I would like you to do is, but we can adjust that when we talk. So my idea was we look at a target group. This is sort of my thinking, that we can't think in the abstract, because if we talk about students here at Brighton University with a disadvantage, that's a very different kind of situation to some children or adolescents with a disability or young adults. Then consider these program sessions. I handed out some copies of this Oyserman paper with these snapshots or these thumbnail sketches of these sessions as something to help your thinking. So there are some more copies here if somebody needs one. And then the question is really, can this be applied to your or our target group? And finally, what do we do with this? How could we study this? How could we set up a pilot and evaluate it? Or is there something existing going on where we could sort of add another focus or a lens, how we look at some of these activities, looking at these reducing discrimination and stigma, increasing the chance to develop the self or the identity, increasing commitment, etc. My idea would be to form groups of anything between 3 and 5 and just focus as a group on one field or one target group, one setting. I would want to leave that up to you. I'm sure you are resilient enough, resourceful enough to work some of that out. So
and
does that?
Number 2 then?
Number 2 would be. But these are these sessions, these snapshots. That's when it says thumbnail at the bottom. Yeah. So you have 4 pages. And at the bottom of the first page, it says thumbnail sketch. And I would like the groups to keep notes. Chrissy is helpfully distributing some pens. Yes. We can rearrange it. We want to move around and find space. Yes, that's fine.
It's going to be a bit of a you're not getting any of the narrative details.
Yeah, no, I mean, my first job ever was on teach school, and I need to have Right, okay, you're back. Sorry to interrupt and sorry to stop it. It seems that people had a lot to talk about. Not sure what, but I didn't listen in. But I'm sure it's all related to the topic. So can we just have a few pointers and expressed around, well, first, I don't know, I think I would just really hear from each group very briefly. What target group, what did you make of these sessions, how would you adapt them, and so on?
I don't know how much it's related to what you're saying, but I mean, having worked on possible selves, future identity, identity formation in different cultural contexts, possible selves, the understanding of possible selves assumes that there are opportunities available there, and you need to develop those identities and make commitments and try to achieve those opportunities. But in such contexts, cultural or national, or due to several systemic reasons, when the opportunities are not there, developing those possible selves becomes more tricky. Because you might be as being a woman in a very traditional and limited resources environment or support system, you might want to be a scientist, but everything in your system might be saying no, and there might be no opportunities. So then I think those possible selves become more difficult and more maladaptive. So it becomes, that brings your perspective that it needs to come with some contextual systemic aspect as well. So it's difficult to, I mean, one of the, although I'm saying that, having said that, I'm very in favor with possible selves and identity theories, but it's really context dependent understanding. It works very well with when opportunities are there, you just need to seek for them, but when opportunities are not there, to achieve those selves that you aim for, then that becomes more a problem.
Can I just challenge that? It doesn't say academic possible selves, it says adult possible selves. And we're all, hopefully, the young people are going to be adults, whether they have an academic aspiration or whether they don't. So this could be utilised and tweaked to allow them to go into their head and their imagination to decide, in an ideal world, what they would like to do with their life. And it could be limited to, this is your reality, and, you know, from an academic, I guess, maybe, I don't know, an academic perspective, you know, okay, I'm not going to get 5 degrees, but actually I will be able to milk that cow, and I will have enough money to have that cow to feed my family of however many, wherever I live. So you could limit it. It doesn't have to, it's not, I didn't read that as an academic self, because I'm not an academic self, so I could have walked away, but I read it as, and it does say, adult possible selves. So, in an, you know, other than tragedy, all of these young people are going to develop into adults. So the fact that they don't have opportunities open for them doesn't negate the fact they're going to be adults.
That's actually very true, because this is more, I see this more from a developmental perspective. Within the development from adolescence or childhood to adulthood, all of us go through some change and become an adult. That includes possible selves, in not only in academics, in every domain of our life. It might be relationships, it might be being, being part of our community. And there are different programs that are using possible selves in terms of using, improving our, outcomes in different domains of life in transition to adulthood from a developmental perspective. But I think it becomes more complicated when it comes to adult life and change after adulthood from, how can I say, it becomes a little bit different perspective than like Oiserman or Nurmi from Finland suggesting about possible self, feared and hope selves for future. But I totally agree with you that from these perspectives, my understanding is this is part of our how we develop. We develop who we are right now, and also who we want to be in the future, and try to achieve this. And with these programs, how we can support that.
Yeah.
And that can happen in any domain. That's
Absolutely,
true.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree.
But it might be more difficult in some domains for some people,
Right.
but more.
Okay,
Yeah.
I want to stop you soon. Can I listen or hear what this group was working on? The group just in front of me, so thank you. Over to your group.
I think just following on very briefly from the lady at the end said there, most of us work with children aged 11 to 18, and one of the fundamental things that we've all got in common is supporting them in achieving whatever their innate potential is. And so that's the target group that we chose, were children of 11 to 18 that are in education. And you talked about Pupil Premium as a way of identifying children who are maybe had a higher level of needs. Do you want to say a little bit about?
Yeah, Pupil Premium is just where it can be if you've got English as an additional language, or if a child gets free school meals, then they automatically become their own group, even if they don't want to be part of that group, because they get this extra funding, and that funding goes through to school. And so utilising that funding to develop this resilience group of setting up everything costs money these days, and so using that funding in a way that would actually increase their resilience would be hopefully a way of bridging the gap, because we always want to bridge attainment gap between pupil premium students and non-pupil premium students.
Well, yeah, I am a secondary teacher. I'm working here at the moment, and one of the things we did in a practical sense is there's a Sky Sports run a program called Living for Sport, and it reads very similar to this in terms of setting students who are disengaged. Normally, we would probably have said pupil premium type students, although we didn't set that in our particular school, and we would give them practical problems to solve, often sports related because I'm a PE specialist, but it just reads that when I particularly looked at the first one, things literally when it says the human knot, they are activities we were doing, things that were breaking barriers down and allowing communication of ideas and maybe for them to explore their self that they might not have even acknowledged before. And this, I'm also involved in something that the university does, which is a project that's run in Israel for a number of years, which is working with Arab and Jewish children, called Football for Peace, which used football as a transport vehicle to spread a message of, in this particular case, coexistence, but use these types of activities to, I think, just to give them understanding of themselves and others. I think that was kind of key. And looking at these, a lot of the activities are things that when I take both those particular projects, we were doing anyway. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah. Just briefly, maybe one or two more groups, maybe one of the groups at the other end of the room, please.
Okay. The target group that we looked at was 18 to 25-year-olds who are long-term need education, employment, and training. And often they come along with complex or multiple needs, which is why they haven't been able to get a job, say, on college or university course. And what we talked about a lot is the context of, we really loved the sessions, but it had to be fixed in the context of the project. And one of the projects that we'll talk about is Natalie's project, which is based on an art gallery. So it would have to be linked back to sort of art and creativity. And we noticed that the weeks 2, 3 and 4 that Oisman had done already were very creative. And so they were key ones that we looked at, really useful, creating sort of timelines and images of self that could be brought into that idea of collages, about what you'd like to have in the future, or that kind of thing. With art as expression and reflection and imagining, and being able to be proud of creating something that you've thought of that day and come up with. But we also talked about one of the things that could be a problem is sometimes young people in these situations really, really struggle to look at the future, in particular thinking about those who are currently in receipt of ESA, perhaps mental health or learning difficulty needs. Some of them have lifetime awards of disability living allowance, and have been given this message that they are going to be on benefit, that they're not going to get a job, and it can be very, very hard to get past that, to imagine a future that isn't really bleak for them, that they say, I don't want to think about carrying on what I'm doing now forever, and being constantly reassessed and reevaluated and having to go through the same form system every couple of years. And so that we're looking not just at academic and career pathways and goals, but goals for how you want to be an adult, what you want to do as an adult, skills you want to get, cooking styles, living independently, doing a fun education course. What is it that you want in the next 5, 10, 30 years, and how can you get there, what steps can you take? And using art to express and explore that creatively.
That's really interesting, yeah.
We're going to really have to stop.
Okay, we'll stop. But can I ask maybe Suna and maybe that you feed back to me somewhat what you did? I think I covered all the other groups briefly. So many thanks. And actually, I thought for me that was very interesting, some of the things you just said. And I think we should definitely pursue this in some way, but we'll need to think a bit about it and sleep over it. So many thanks for coming. And if there is anything else you want to know, or you need some of the papers, let me know, and I'll send them around, even if you are not supposed to. But sorry, I haven't said that.
Will it go on the website?
Yeah, we'll put your
presentation
PowerPoint up on the Boing Boing website, so everyone can just download that anyway. And it is something that we want to.
I need to edit it a little bit to not be accused of plagiarism.
Oh right. Oh, we better do that.
Yeah.
And just because it's related. If you I do a program that I was also involved about using same ideas about developing relationships, healthy relationships with peers and partners. There is really not, it was very similar framework as well. So if you're interested, then I can forward
maybe if you forward that to me, and I add that at the end as a slide on this.
Oh, good. Oh, yeah, that would be good.
That would be
Okay.
perhaps a good idea.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Right.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Yes. You do a good job explaining, some of this stuff, which is always easy. So, since you got that skill, we'll definitely be having you back.